Hi folks, Mr. Ackerman here. Thanks for watching. In today's video, I want to talk to you a little bit about two important topics in photography. One of them is composition and one is editing. And I want to relate them to a couple of photos that some of my students have created in the last little while. Just for reference, it is now December 28th, 2019. So if you are watching this in and around that time, maybe you know the students. One's name is Baron and the other is Junhee. And the photos that they created were for an assignment called composite or multiple exposure images. I'll get to that in a moment. What we're going to talk about is how they composed the images, whether their photos told a story and sent the appropriate message to the viewer, and whether that message made sense, and if not, how they might have changed it. And in doing so, we'll talk a little bit about their use of space and whether they included things that maybe shouldn't have been there, or they left things out that should have been there. And after that, we'll get to the editing of their photos. We'll talk about ways they could have improved the appearance, maybe by cropping in a different way, or by adjusting the exposure so that the highlights and the shadows were revealing a little bit more detail. We'll also talk a little bit about the white balance, or the color temperature as it's sometimes referred to, just to make sure that things appear natural in terms of the colors that we're used to seeing. And finally, we'll talk briefly about some other specific targeted adjustments they might have made. So to give you some context, the images that I'm going to show you, the first one by Baron looks like this. You can see she appears 3 times in the image, and it's trying to tell a story, obviously, of her cooking something. And I think she's done a great job. I'll tell you why in a moment. And Junhee did a similar kind of multiple exposure image, this one outside, and you can see that it looks like someone's throwing a tennis ball at himself and he's getting knocked over. So also a strong image, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think were done well and other things that could have been improved. So to give you a way of looking at this that hopefully is going to help in addition to the words I'm using, I'm going to show you, I think Baron, what we're going to talk about with her image is how she could have controlled the highlights and shadows, so the bright regions like over here and the shadow regions in there, and also what kind of a job she did telling a story with the different images of herself, and finally the color or the white balance in the image and how that might have been improved. And in terms of the improvements I think she might have made, I want to show you how to get from this image to something like that, which has a little bit more detail and a little bit more natural color. And then in Junhee's image, we're going to talk again about the storytelling. I'm also going to point out his use of space, and finally the level of detail that he has in his highlight and shadow regions. And in making some changes, I want to show you how I got from this to that. All right, so getting back to the images, let's open them in Camera Raw. We'll go to the first one, Baron's. And here we go. So the first thing I want to talk about is the sort of yellowish cast. I don't know if you notice it, but there are certain things in here where the color doesn't quite look right. The fridge, for example, this is a stainless steel fridge. It should be colorless. It should just have kind of a tone, like a grayish tone. And the reason it doesn't have that is partly because of the temperature. I think it's a little too warm. So I'm going to cool it down, moving the temperature slider to the left, and all of a sudden you can see that things which I know are gray, like stainless steel, look gray, and things which are probably white, like the cabinets here, are starting to look more white. Even things like socks. Things that are black, like her pants here, the stovetop, are starting to look more natural as well. If I hit the preview button before and after, you see we already have an improvement. So that's one thing that I would like Baron to concentrate on in her editing. Now let's talk a little bit about the highlights and shadows. So the highlights are the bright regions. Do they have detail? And the answer is pretty much everywhere, yes. There's a few areas that are almost lacking detail, like up here where there's probably a light shining down on them. If I wanted, I could move the highlight slider a bit to the left, and that would recover detail in the cabinet there, although it's not that important, and it has darkened the overall image. So if I really want the detail here, I can kind of add a little bit more exposure back like that, and then by doing this, I think the overall brightness has remained about the same, even if it is a tiny bit darker. Maybe go a little bit more, and I've recovered a little bit of detail. In the shadow regions, like her pants, for example, you can't really see much detail. The shadows are kind of crushed there, so I could bring the shadows up a bit. And now there's starting to be a little bit more detail in her legs there. You don't want to go too far, or you're going to get a very fuzzy, grainy kind of appearance, almost like the clothes have just been taken out of the laundry and they're full of lint or something. So we don't want to go too far, maybe just to there, and leave it. If you find you're losing contrast, you can up the contrast and or the clarity slider there just to bring a little bit of contrast back in. And so before and after, what do we think? Yeah, I think this is an improvement, so I'm going to leave it there. What I want to comment on is her storytelling. I think she did a really good job of telling a story of someone who is baking something. She's got herself looking for ingredients in the pantry and then in the fridge, and then she's checking on what she's cooking in the oven, which I think is great. A couple of criticisms here. One, I'd like to see her face a little bit more, and two, I would like to know what exactly it is she's baking. Maybe I'd like to see the ingredients on the countertop, or a big mess, something like flour all over the place and chocolate syrup and things like that. It would be really cool to see her in one more pose, maybe holding the finished product, whatever it was that she was making. In other words, we want to tell the story in a more complete, coherent way, but even with that thing missing, I think she's done a great job. The images of her don't overlap. There's lots of room for the viewer's eye to move around, and each pose is different and interesting. So I think Baron did a really, really good job, and I think I've given her some concrete things for improvement, and that's what we're here for. So moving on, going to click Done, and now we're going to take a look at Junhee's image. So we're going to right-click, Open in Camera Raw, and let's take a look here. Where should we start? Let's start with his storytelling. I think he did a great job of telling a complete story. He's got the subject throwing the ball, is apparently getting hit by the ball or running away from the ball and then falling down. So all of this seems to have a complete start to finish story, which is really well done. One thing that is, I think Junhee overlooked was the use of space in the sky here. The sky's not particularly interesting, it's just a plain gray sky, and I don't think it really is adding anything to the photo, so I'm going to recommend cropping that out. I'm going to click the crop button here, we're going to drag out a crop box, and we're going to fill the frame with what we want, and we're going to get rid of everything else. I'm going to hit enter, and right away you see that you're way more focused on the action, and your eye isn't wandering to places where there's nothing to reward you for looking. I now notice that the image is kind of on the dark side, so I'm going to take the exposure slider and move it to the right until I get a brightness that I like, which is maybe about here. That brings out a lot of detail in the shadow regions, but one thing it does is it costs me detail in the highlights. The highlights have gone so bright, the snow, that I can't really see much. It's kind of looking plain white. So what I can do is bring the highlight slider down a bit to recover detail, and now you can sort of see footprints and whatnot in there, although that has cost me a little bit of my brightness, so I'm kind of going to fight that by upping the exposure a bit, and you'll find a happy medium here where the overall brightness is good enough and the detail is good enough. If you click before and after, we've lost a little bit of detail in the snow, but not too much, and the reward is that we've got a lot more brightness in the shadow regions. In terms of the color here, I don't think there needs to be any adjustment. The snow, which I know is white, looks white. This guy's jacket, which I'm guessing is black, looks pretty black. Skin tones look fine, so I'm happy with this. I don't really want to mess around with too much. Maybe add a little bit of contrast like that, using the contrast slider or the clarity, but at this point, I think I'm happy with what I see. And so if I go back to what I intended to do in the beginning, work on composition and editing, I think you'll see I've made improvements in most of these areas. There's just one last thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is should we make specific adjustments like with the adjustment brush, the HSL sliders, black and white conversion, or a vignette? Well, these are kind of the standard ones that I often look at when I'm editing a photo. I don't always do them, but they're in the back of my mind. If we start with the adjustment brush, that's this one up here, shortcut letter K. This is something that might allow me to, I don't know, maybe paint in a bit of brightness on these trees if I wanted them to be brighter. Like I could take the exposure slider up a bit, I could select a brush size that will fit into the trees there, and then I could start clicking and painting in extra brightness, being careful not to go over areas of the photo that I don't want to make brighter. And this might help bring out a little bit of detail in an area that's otherwise a little bit dark and hard to see. So then I can always go to the before and after button. Do I like it? Sure, why not? Let's keep that there. Do I want a little bit more detail in the jacket here? Maybe I want to brighten that up. So paint in a little bit of brightness here. Just being careful, remember, with black, with shadows, if you brighten them too much, you kind of get a sort of fuzzy, it almost looks like there's lint on the clothes, like they just came out of the dryer. And so you got to be careful with that. But before and after, okay, I think there's nothing wrong with what I've done here. Turn off the overlay to see it without these pins there. Before and after, sure, looks fine. So let's click done, and then we'll just go back to Baron's image here and see, is there anything that we can do in a targeted sort of way? I don't think there's any areas that I need to brighten specifically. Maybe I could try a black and white conversion. I don't know how that would look. Let's have a peek. It's actually kind of striking. I like the contrast here. So maybe that would be something to play around with. Even go to the HSL sliders and see if there's any parts of the photo that had a certain color that I can now brighten or darken. So let's see. If I go, oh, look what's happening on the stovetop there. There's that red crock pot that was red, and so in black and white, it'll respond to the red slider. Orange often hits skin tones, so I can actually brighten up her arms there a little bit and make her a little more prominent in the photo like that. And if I click default, that brings me back to where I started. And if I hit Control Z to go back a step, yeah, I think I like this a little bit better. So I'm going to leave that there. I've made a change. Do I like it better than the color image? You know what? I think I prefer it in color, but I'm glad that I tried the black and white to see if that was an option. Sometimes you'll end up with two photos out of one because it works in color and black and white. Anyway, there's other things that we could have done, like add a vignette, but you guys know all about that stuff, so I'm going to leave it. At this point, what I hope you got to see was that with these two ideas in mind, you can really improve the appearance of a photo. But I'm always a big advocate for starting off with the best possible photo. And the way you do that is by concentrating on your composition, asking yourself at all times, does the photo I'm taking make sense? What is this going to look like in the end? What message are people going to get from it? And if you plan your photo and shoot it accordingly, you're going to find that the editing takes your photo from, let's say, a B+ or an A- to an A or an A+, and that's what we're going for. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I'm looking forward to seeing the improvements that are going to happen in your photos now that you apply some of these ideas. And since it is December 28th, if you're watching this before New Year's, Happy New Year. And if you're watching it after, I hope you had a good New Year and a good holiday. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later. Bye for now.